Good morning, everyone. I'm Brandon Fess with the Local History and Genealogy Division of the Rochester Public Library. Welcome to our March 2023 edition of Mourning in the Morning. For today's presentation, we have Helen Pitts Douglass, advocate, wife, keeper of the flame. While the interracial marriage between Helen Pitts of Honeoye, New York, and Frederick Douglass, preeminent leader of 19th-century Black America, scandalized many in the country and in Douglass's family, Helen's life had already shown her independent spirit and deep commitment to social progress. Following Frederick's death in 1895, Helen devoted herself and her resources to preserving his legacy, sometimes against apathy and opposition from the unlikeliest of sources. Despite achieving her goal of saving Douglass's papers, his possessions, and his home in Washington, D.C. for future generations, Helen Pitts Douglass died in relative obscurity, her life and accomplishments relegated over the years to little more than an historical footnote. Our presenter today is Michael Nighan. For many years, Michael Nighan, like Helen Pitts, raised in Honeoye, New York, has written about the local history of Western New York and the famous and not so famous who have traveled through the region or made it their home. Most recently has been a contributor to the blog, Talker of the Town. Without further ado, I turn it over to Michael Nighan.
Well, thank you, Brandon, and good morning, everyone, on this snowy pre-St. Patrick's Day. As Brandon mentioned, the talk is on Helen Pitts Douglass, advocate, wife, keeper of the flame. Helen Pitts Douglass is all but forgotten today, remembered when remembered at all by a small handful of scholars. But for a time in the late 19th century, simply by saying "I do," she became the most infamous woman in America. Researching and writing about her life is at times an exercise in frustration, given that Helen went overnight from being an unknown woman from a small village in upstate New York to being the wife, and the white wife at that, of Frederick Douglass, the most famous, influential, and respected Black leader in America. Suddenly the subject of intense media scrutiny, a lack of ready facts about Helen and her life pre-Frederick, resulted in the blanks being filled by elaborations, faulty and enhanced recollections, mistakes, innuendos, and lies, all exacerbated in later years by her lack of descendants, by missing information and missing years in her life, the repetition of erroneous information, and her relegation to near unpersoned status following her death. So the recounting of Helen's story can be a challenge, but here goes. From a speech delivered by Frederick Douglass at Buffalo, New York, 1851. I believe that simultaneously with the landing of the Pilgrims, there landed slaves on the shores of this continent, and that for 230 years and more, we have had a foothold on this continent. Little could Frederick Douglass have dreamt that 3 decades after he spoke those words, he'd become a living link between pilgrims and slaves, between Plymouth Rock and the people it fell on. You could be forgiven for assuming that the only thing that Douglass's ancestors and the Pilgrims had in common was that they had all arrived in America by ship, with a significant difference that the Pilgrims came voluntarily looking for freedom, while Douglass's forebears were dragged here in chains, having lost theirs. And that's all the connection there was for most of Douglass's life. Then in 1884, the son of slaves married Helen Pitts, a direct descendant of those archetypal pilgrims, John and Priscilla Alden, the textbook face of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America, in a wedding that, low-key as it was, represented an almost mystical union, linking the ultimate outsiders in American history to the ultimate insiders. Helen Pitts was born October 14, 1837, in the family home in the hamlet of Honeoye in upstate New York. Emigrating from Massachusetts, the Pitts family had settled in Honeoye. Indeed, had founded the settlement, originally called Pitchtown, in 1789. Their home, located near today's Honeoye Central School, had been built in 1790 and repeatedly expanded and improved until 1856, when her father Gideon and her mother Jane moved Helen and her 4 surviving siblings to a newer home in the center of the community. Gideon Pitts was a hardcore abolitionist, so committed that he became a station master on the Underground Railroad, receiving escaped slaves brought to Honeoye in the false bottom of a hearse by Naples undertaker Billy Marks. And so committed to abolition were many of Gideon's neighbors that years later a Rochester newspaper would wax rhapsodic about the community. Quote, in Honeoye at an early day, the abolition conventions were a frequent occurrence. and thus the place was educated not only in anti-slavery ideas, but freed from many of the prejudices of caste, unquote. In addition to social reforms such as abolition, many of the residents of Honeoye had also been influenced by the various religious revivals which had swept through the burnt-over district, that part of New York roughly west of Syracuse, which had stressed that morality in this world was a necessary precursor to individual salvation in the next. By 1843, Gideon and his neighbors, concluding that their local congregational church was insufficiently activist, decided to withdraw and form their own church and bring to the community a solid anti-slavery man committed to moral reform to lead it. Enter William Goodell, not an ordained minister, but a devout reformer, anti-slavery author, and newspaper publisher who thundered from the pulpit that no man or woman was a Christian who first and foremost did not favor the immediate abolition of slavery. While in Honeoye, Goodell continued to publish his newspaper, The Christian Investigator, arguing, among other points, that laws barring interracial marriage were an infringement of human and divine rights and a blatant hypocrisy given the actions of slave owners who abused their marriage vows by their relations with their female slaves. And so it was that as part of this abolition activities, in early 1852, William Goodell brought to Honeoye a star of the anti-slavery movement to speak at his church, a young runaway slave named Frederick Douglass. From Frederick Douglass's paper, April 8, 1852. Since the last issue, I have delivered 5 anti-slavery lectures, 2 at Hemlock Lake, Livingston County, 2 at Honeoye, Ontario County, and 1 in the Congregational Church, St. Paul Street, Rochester. This being my first visit to Honeoye, the Friends of the Slave thought that it would be well for me to narrate my experience in slavery. This I did in my second lecture, and it was most gratifying to observe the evidence of sympathy in young and old as they listened to my simple story. At the close of my lecture, several came forward and subscribed to my paper and otherwise rendered me material aid. Among those who provided financial aid to Douglass was Gideon Pitts. Helen was 14 at this time, and it requires no stretch of the imagination to assume that Gideon took her and the rest of the family to hear Douglass speak. It might tell us a lot about why the future unfolded as it did if we can know what the teenage Helen Pitts thought of Frederick Douglass. Did she find him dashing, a source of pity for his days as a slave? Was she awestruck by his performance as a speaker and impressed by the high regard in which he was held by her father and Mr. Goodell? Unfortunately, we'll never know. But it seems inevitable that Helen, continually exposed to Goodell's sermons and writings, would have been strongly influenced by those social and religious views, as well as by the views so earnestly held by her family, many of her neighbors, and Frederick Douglass. But Gideon's radical abolitionism wasn't his only unusual for the time's social view. He also believed that his daughters, as well as his son, should receive a college education. As a result, Helen and her sister Jenny first attended the Genesee Wesleyan Seminary in Lima and later transferred to Mount Holyoke in Massachusetts. The Mount Holyoke Female Seminary had been founded by educational pioneer Mary Lyon, her vision being of a school where women would learn not just the classics, penmanship, and languages, but mathematics and science. And although more traditional classes in those domestic duties and household management skills, which a well-bred mid-19th century American woman was expected to be fluent in, were offered, Lyon did not intend Mount Holyoke to simply graduate future wives. Training young women to be teachers and missionaries was a major goal of the institution, a goal which Helen later took to heart. Enrolling in Mount Holyoke in 1857, Helen was able to complete the 3-year curriculum in 2 years, graduating as a member of the class of 1859. In the years after Mount Holyoke, as the United States was careening towards civil war, we have little information on Helen's activities until March 1863, when she applied to the American Missionary Association for a teaching post in the South, where the association was striving to bring education to the contrabands, slaves who had escaped their masters and made it to the protection of the Union lines. Quickly hired, Helen was sent to Norfolk, Virginia, where she became one of a handful of teachers who, with few books and no classroom facilities, had to deal each day with hundreds of ex-slaves seeking to remedy the lack of education imposed on them by Virginia's slave code. Life at Norfolk must have been an exceptionally wrenching experience for Helen. Despite having grown up in a household steeped in an abolitionist Christianity, Helen's only interaction with Blacks, Honeoye counting but one family among its residents, would have been a fleeting glimpse of the escaped slaves conducted through her home via the Underground Railroad. And despite its progressive credentials, Mount Holyoke had no Blacks in its student body until decades after Helen had graduated. Then just after a few weeks at Norfolk, the excessive heat combined with the strain of her workload and the questionable sanitary conditions she was forced to live in, Helen fell victim to what was called dumb ague, a generic term for several diseases up to and including malaria and tuberculosis. In August, she returned home where her family could care for her. Responding to this care, within a few weeks, Helen felt well enough to return to her pupils and to get involved in a brouhaha with local disgruntled locals, an event later recounted in a newspaper article. While she was in the South, several of her pupils were insulted and abused by residents of Norfolk. She immediately caused the arrest of the offenders, and they were all fined. But Helen's health again deteriorated, and by March 1864, her father had come to Norfolk to take her back to the family home in Honeoye. So serious was her illness that it was over a year before she was allowed to sit up in bed for an hour each day. The decade between Helen's return from Norfolk in the mid-1870s are mostly blank pages in her life. Her recovery was a lengthy one spent under the care of her family. What she read and thought about, or what her activities were, can only be speculated on. What we do know is that although the mean age for women to marry at this time was 23, Helen was still single as she approached 40. Helen finally reappears in 1876, where we find her giving a lecture on the dangers of moderate drinking at the September meeting of the Ontario County Women's Temperance Union. Over the next 5 years, Helen's sedentary sojourn was replaced by a restless whirlwind of activity, new experiences, new locales, and new responsibilities. 1877 found her living with her uncle and aunt, Hiram and Frances Pitt, in the Anacostia section of the District of Columbia, where soon after her arrival, Frederick Douglass and his wife and family moved to Cedar Hill, a stately home sitting on a hilltop next door to the Pitts home. Living in Washington, Helen began to participate in the women's suffrage and proto-feminist movement by becoming a member of the Moral Education Society. The goal of the society, articulated via the newspaper The Alpha, was to be an exponent of the purest morals through self-control and self-denial, and to foster the improvement of the human race by the wise use of all our endowments and the blessing of good uses for all our appetites. To accomplish this, the society believed that women must have access to higher education, health care, including sex education, birth control, and the vote. Interestingly, Helen's association with the society seems to have lasted for only a year or so. As a result, the often printed assertion that she wrote articles for or even co-edited The Alpha has recently had a good deal of doubt cast on it. By 1878, Helen was teaching school in Huntington, Indiana, where the local newspaper would later tartly report that her students would remember her with feelings not altogether akin with pleasure after she quit before the end of the school year. Back in Uncle Hiram's home by 1880, Helen was able to obtain a clerkship at the federal pension office. Then 2 years later came a call from Frederick Douglass offering her a job. By 1877, after years as a political and social critic and newspaper publisher, his latest paper, The New National Era, having folded in 1874, Frederick Douglass's finances were in bad shape. So when newly elected President Rutherford B. Hayes offered him the patronage job of U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia, Douglass accepted, the steady income allowing him to purchase Cedar Hill. Although the marshal's position was largely administrative rather than a wire-up style lawman's office, the appointment required Senate confirmation, and Douglass became the first Black American to be so confirmed. Douglass held the job until 1881, when incoming President James Garfield nominated him to be the Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia. An obscure job, it was a step down from Marshal as far as public visibility was concerned, but a far more remunerative post, and one that included the ability to dispense patronage and staff hiring. The sheer volume of handwritten paperwork required Douglass to hire a large staff of clerks, among which were his sons and his daughter Rosetta, who acted as office manager. And to his staff was added in 1882 a new copyist, Helen Pitts. Helen and the Douglass children seem to have had an amicable professional relationship, with Rosetta often praising Helen's work to her father. Then for Douglass and his children, tragedy struck. After a lengthy illness, Anna Murray Douglass died. When Anna Douglass, Frederick's wife of more than 40 years, passed away at Cedar Hill on August 4th, 1882, he fell into a deep depression. Writing in response to condolences he received from an old friend, he replied, "She was the post in the center of my house. Different we were on many things. She was conservative and I radical. She was for the old, I for the new. She did not care to learn to read and was thus measurably shut out from the things that interested me. But in all the duties of mother and wife, she deserves all you have said of her. Two people could not well live together 44 years as we have done without the death of either being a shock and a calamity." Douglass had often mentioned to friends his unhappiness that Anna's never having learned to read rendered it difficult for them to discuss literature or current events. He told one correspondent years before of having participated in Shakespeare reading with a local dramatic club. "I find it very pleasant and entertaining, but I have no one in my house to go with me. And I often fancy I am missing one half of the happiness of such occasions because in such matters I am alone." In the months following Anna's death, given Helen's educational background, her obvious intelligence, and the commonality of their interests, more than a friendship was developing between Douglass and Helen. But only they knew how soon they would each be putting their feelings and their beliefs to the test. Now we come to January 24th, 1884. While accounts vary, at least one contemporary report says that Douglass called his children together and informed them that he was going to marry Helen Pitts that evening. Doubtless seeing as an insult to their mother, who had died less than 18 months earlier, their shock at both the marriage and the timing of the announcement can be imagined. Whether or not they're invited to the wedding, they didn't attend. As to Helen's relatives, although her mother and sister were in DC staying with Hiram Pitts on an extended visit, Helen had not informed them of her wedding plans. As a result, the next morning, picking up the newspaper, they were astounded to read the headline, "A Black Man's Bride. Frederick Douglass married last night to Miss Helen Pitts. The bride young, attractive, intelligent, and white." Reading on, they learned that Helen and Douglass had been married at the home of the Reverend Francis Grimke in a private ceremony, after which Helen had moved her belongings to Cedar Hill. Confronting Helen and confirming the existence of the marriage, Mrs. Pitts and Helen's sister indignantly returned to Honeoye. Arriving home, they found that Gideon, despite years as a committed abolitionist and being a longtime friend of Douglass, was equally outraged by the marriage. It needs to be understood that while all abolitionists wanted slavery ended, and many supported granting some degree of political civil rights to Blacks, many nevertheless, apparently including Gideon Pitts, strongly opposed the idea of social equality between the races. Indeed, so outraged was Gideon by the marriage that he reportedly never spoke or wrote to Douglass again and had only limited contact with Helen, though not a total break, as some sources state. While he did eventually write her out of his will, that action might have been more an acknowledgement that Helen now had a husband to provide for her, whereas her two unmarried sisters did not. Although Frederick and Helen passed through Rochester on their obligatory honeymoon trip to Niagara Falls, a visit to Honeoye wasn't undertaken, and quite understandably, Douglass never visited Honeoye again. National outrage in the newspapers came next. Although some publications saw the marriage as no one's business but the newlyweds, oceans of ink were spent hyperbolically speculating on the reasons for the marriage and condemning and scorning Douglass and Helen. White newspapers took the position from polite took the position from polite disapproval to viciously racist diatribes, while the black press condemned Douglass for demeaning black women by his choice of a white wife. To this criticism was added scornful suggestions that Helen was low-born and a common adventuress who had infatuated the great Douglass. There was also much tisk-tisking over their age difference. Douglass was 66, Helen 46. Although their ages were later manipulated until it was being reported that Douglass was almost twice as old as his new wife, and that Helen was younger than Douglass's daughters. Later, some critics sneeringly questioned why Douglass had stooped to marrying a lowly clerk in his office. The New York Morning Journal. If the wedding had taken place across the Potomac in Virginia, Douglass would have been hanged, said an excited Virginian today, and Miss Pitts would have been driven out of the state. We have some respect for our families in Virginia. Oh, if we were only living in France, said a young lady this afternoon with great indignation, and in the days of the Bastille, how I would like to send that woman there for life. National Enquirer, Walden, North Carolina. Beneath the curling smoke of epithets and the debris of slander, Mr. Douglass has been spurned with contempt for daring to marry. And why? Because he married the choice of his affection. On the broad base that a man has the right to marry whom he pleases, and in a matter suitable to the contracting parties, how dare the ravenous, prejudicial public infringe upon that basis? Rotten to the core and stained by defamation are the arguments against this union. The Weekly News. Fred Douglass has married a red-headed white girl. We have no further use for him. His picture hangs in our parlor. We will hang it in the stables. New York World. Frederick Douglass is intellectually and morally the superior of thousands and tens of thousands of white men. He has more learning, more culture, more political and general knowledge than 2/3 of the members of any ordinary state legislature. What offense does the lady commit who marries such a man? She takes a husband with a dark skin. If she had married one of the many low-born, ignorant white scamps who've been kicked out of all decent circles, her friends would not have objected. But she has chosen an intelligent, honorable, able colored man and has given a shock to Washington society. Chicago Sun. What's all this rumpus about anyhow? If Fred Douglass wanted to throw himself away on a bit of white trash, we don't know why all the other, racist term redacted, need feel such a personal interest in the matter. Franklin, Virginia Gazette. This man's act is a deliberate challenge to the Caucasian race. In what other light can it be regarded? Does anyone believe that this man at 70 years of age was induced to marry this woman from those motives and sentiments of regard that usually lead to marriage? Nothing of the sort. The object and purpose of the act was to set an example before his race, which in emulation of their leader, they would be proud to follow. The object was to break down the social barrier that now properly divides the races. Christian Record. We almost feel like asking Mr. Douglass's pardon for this public reference to his marriage. The only excuse we offer is that the public in general insist upon making it a matter of talk. Our say is that it is no third person's business who Mr. Douglass or Mr. anybody else marries, and we very much doubt whether such would be the case in any other country than America, where exists a tyranny the worst the world ever saw in regard to marriage. No man in America is free to marry the woman of his choice unless she be of the same color as he. Let him presume to marry a woman of any other color, and he is cast out of society as though he were a very leper. In braving this social despotism, the old man eloquent has shown that the fires of liberty still burn within him, as when in his younger days he braved the physical despotism of his old master. A word more. Complaint is made that he married his copyist. Is the country too stupid to recognize the fact that among Americans, neither the lineage nor the character of a person can be judged from their occupation? In conclusion, the country at large has a fine opportunity to mind its own business. And not passing up an opportunity to utilize either the scandal or the public's ingrained racism in their marketing, some advertisers, such as the manufacturers of the patent medicine sulfur bitters, even stooped to ridiculing the Douglass-Pitts marriage to make a buck. But criticism and condemnation also came from unexpected quarters. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote Susan B. Anthony proposing that they draft a public announcement of support for Douglass's marriage. However, Anthony, working to make suffrage inroads in the Jim Crow South, opposed such a move in no uncertain terms, terms, literally pleading with Stanton, "I do hope you won't put your foot into the question of intermarriage of the races. It has no place on our platform any more than the question of no marriage at all or of polygamy. And so far as I can prevent it, shall not be brought there. Do not throw around that marriage the halo of a pure and lofty duty to break down race lines." Douglass had by this act compromised every movement in which he should be brought to the front. "I would cut my right hand off before I would thus set back the growing feeling of friendliness towards our cause, but enough. Only for my sake, if for no other, don't proclaim yourself as endorsing this act." Stanton backed down, limiting herself to a private letter of support to Douglass. Although Douglass and Helen would seldom publicly respond to criticism of their marriage, later that year, Douglass half-jokingly told an audience in Atlanta, "My father was white, my mother was black. My first wife was black, my second wife is white. I've paid my respects to both of my parents." He would subsequently use similar analogies at other venues to describe his marriage. In private, writing to their friends, Douglass and Helen were more candid in their statements. "Love came to me," Helen wrote, "but I was not afraid to marry the man I loved because of his color." Writing in August to Amy Post, an old friend in Rochester, Douglass was far more open in his anger. "What business has the world with the color of my wife? It wants to know how old she is, how her parents and friends like her marriage, how I courted her, whether with love or with money, whether we are happy or miserable now that we have been married for 7 months." To add insult to injury, in February 1886, Douglass, Helen, and Douglass's 21-year-old granddaughter attended a White House reception. In the receiving line, Douglass was put in the position of having to explain to President Grover Cleveland that the young mulatto girl next to him was not his wife as announced, but that the demure-looking white lady was. Ironically, 4 months later, the 49-year-old bachelor Cleveland would marry the 21-year-old Frances Folsom. On a similar note, the discussion of age differentials was likely not a topic of conversation at Uncle Hiram's table, given his wife, Emily Frances Post, had been 22 years his junior when they were married. For the first time in her life, Helen now personally experienced a form of racial prejudice. As Douglass later confided to a friend, "I want to tell you that you are the only colored woman save Mrs. Grimke who has come into my house as a guest and has treated Helen as a hostess has the right to be treated by her guests. Many of them were cordial to me, but kept Helen outside the pale simply because she was white and had committed the crime of marrying me." At the end of the day, it's always seemed to me that the critics of the Douglass Pitts marriage never understood that age and skin color aside, for all intents and purposes, Anna Murray and Helen Pitts had married two different men. Anna had married a penniless, semi-literate runaway slave named Fred Bailey, who she had helped to escape bondage. But Helen had married Frederick Douglass, a noted orator with an international reputation, a successful journalist and author, an associate of presidents, and the acknowledged leader of Black America. Unlike the quiet and more family-oriented days at Cedar Hill when Anna was alive, Helen and Frederick now began to host luncheons, musicales, dinner parties, and open houses, sometimes with as many as 100 guests dropping by. Helen also began accompanying Frederick on his speaking tours, something the shyer Anna had declined to do. But Douglass's years as a private official were coming to a close. With a change of administrations in 1885, he was asked to resign his office of Recorder of Deeds. With perhaps more free time on his hands than he wanted, but with apparently improved finances, Douglass decided it was time to turn his attention to a bucket list item, a grand tour of Europe with Helen. So in September 1886, the Douglasses set sail for New York on the steamship City of Rome, over the next 9 months visiting Liverpool, London, Paris, Naples, Rome, Athens, Florence, Venice, Egypt, Greece, Milan, and Lucerne. On the ship and on the continent, Helen finally glimpsed a vision of true racial equality when she saw how, unlike in the United States, European whites treated Frederick with respect and a lack of condescension, and dealt with the two of them as husband and wife, not as a black husband and a white wife. Thoughts of that treatment must have crossed Helen's mind when her father Gideon died suddenly in June 1888. Despite a lack of direct evidence for Helen's attendance at his funeral in Honeoye, it must be assumed. Returning to Cedar Hill, friction with his neighbor popped up in August when Douglass found it necessary to send the following letter to Hiram Pitts. Sir, oblige me by removing your cows from my premises. P.S. I observe that your turkeys are in my lot most of the time, and I have given strict orders that they shall not be injured, but I really would like to have them kept at home if possible. The next year, Helen was in Honeoye again, looking after her husband when she received a letter from Frederick in response to reports she must have sent him regarding the attitude of her sister, Lorinda Pitts Short. Wrote her husband, "It is fortunate that this world and that America is not wholly comprised of Shorts. I need give myself no concern about the hate and malice of the Shorts. I hope you will bear yourself not proudly, but with your own dignity, and wherever you go in Honeoye, you will not be ashamed of yourself or of your husband." But Douglass had more important matters on his mind. On July 1st, 1889, he'd been appointed U.S. Minister to Haiti by President Benjamin Harrison in recognition of the significant assistance he had rendered in his election. Despite having expected a more prestigious appointment, Douglass nevertheless accepted the assignment. It was a decision he quickly regretted, and within 2 years, he resigned the post. Douglass had been planning to travel to Haiti alone, but Helen insisted on accompanying him, despite concerns that the climate, like that at Norfolk years before, would be injurious to her health. Helen went and eventually fell ill, contracting rheumatic fever, and at one point seeming to be near death. After returning to the U.S., Helen had to endure one final illness, the death of her mother. After returning to the U.S., Helen had to endure the final illness and death of her mother, Jane, in March 1882. Accompanying the body back to Honeoye, Helen attended the funeral at Lakeview Cemetery. Early in the evening of February 20th, 1895, having just turned 77, Frederick Douglass returned home to Cedar Hill after spending the day talking to his old friend, ally, and sometimes opponent, Susan B. Anthony, at a women's rights meeting. While recounting for Helen the events of the day, Douglass suddenly collapsed to the floor and died within minutes, felled by a heart attack. One of the first to arrive at Cedar Hill to pay their respects was Susan B. Anthony. 4 days later, Douglass's funeral was held at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington. For whatever reason, Helen sat alone. At her own request? Or had she again outraged public sensibilities? Because perhaps emulating those women who were advocating ditching Victorian widow's weeds of black in the belief that they denigrated a woman's personal grief by making a public spectacle, Helen had appeared at the funeral dressed in brown. Helen believed that Douglass should be buried on the grounds of Cedar Hill, but the wishes of his children and the expectations of the public made clear that his burial would be at Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, in the city where he had lived the longest, and in the cemetery where his youngest daughter was buried. Back in 1860, following the death of 10-year-old Annie, the distraught Douglass had purchased a plot at Mount Hope, where for 35 years his daughter had rested alone in an unmarked grave, unaccompanied even by her mother, who the family had buried in the District of Columbia following her death in 1882. Now a train was bringing her father back to Rochester to join her on the Mount Hope hillside. In Rochester, the streets were jammed as Douglass's casket was moved to the Central Church on Sophia Street, today's Hochstein School on Plymouth Avenue, for a second funeral, after which a lengthy procession with brass bands playing dirges escorted the casket from the church to Mount Hope Cemetery, where Frederick was temporarily laid to rest in the receiving vault until warmer days would make it possible to dig his grave. Returning in May to a far more private ceremony, Helen and her stepchildren watched as Douglass's casket was interred in the family plot. Later, contacting the John P. Weston Company on South Clinton Avenue, Helen purchased for Frederick a massive granite memorial stone with simple brass lettering, for which she paid $225. The stone was installed just after Memorial Day, 1898. There's no indication that Helen journeyed to Rochester for the installation. A few months later, Helen was notified by the superintendent of Mount Hope Cemetery that the Douglass children had contracted for the installation of a family memorial stone. Concerned that the plot would be overcrowded, the superintendent wrote Helen, "It does not seem that considering the size of the lot and the large granite slab already placed there by yourself, that this would be in keeping. If control of the lot rests with you, would you kindly advise what your wishes are in the matter?" It was at this time that Helen discovered that in March 1898, the Douglass children had had the body of their mother moved from her DC burial site to Mount Hope Cemetery, where she was reinterred next to Douglass and their child Annie. Whatever Helen's personal wishes, the matter was settled as the Douglass children had proposed, and their stone was set in place later that year. The two stones stand there today, corner to corner, joined recently by additional memorial stones for Anna Murray Douglass and little Annie. Having buried her husband, Helen now struggled with how she could preserve the memory and legacy of an ex-slave and national Black leader at a time when Jim Crow segregation was on the rise. On the face of it, her plan was simple. Using Washington's Mount Vernon as a template, Helen sought to turn Cedar Hill into a memorial and a museum of Frederick's activities on behalf of abolition and human rights. Broaching the idea to Douglass's children, Helen was shocked to find that they opposed it and instead sought to have the house sold and the proceeds divvied up. To be fair, as adults having established homes and families of their own and having lived only infrequently at Cedar Hill, the place had little sentimental attachment for them, particularly as their mother had only lived there for 5 years. The next blow came when Frederick's will was read. Although Helen was to receive Cedar Hill, all Frederick's writings, books, and papers, and a significant cash settlement, with the Douglass children to receive his remaining real estate in Rochester and elsewhere, there was a major snag. The will was defective, necessitating an extended probate process. The probate court named Helen and Douglass's son Lewis as administrators of the estate, but invalidated the will as far as the disposition of Douglass's real estate in the district. The flaws in the will set up a clash with Helen, Lewis, and the other Douglass children as to the distribution of Frederick's estate. The newspapers began to print a stream of stories, real and imagined, about how some of the Douglass children were planning to contest the will, as well as how valuable the estate was. The Democrat and Chronicle erroneously reported that it was worth $200,000, quote, and will be a rich plum for lawyers and litigants to fight over, unquote. When the probate court eventually ruled that Helen was entitled to Frederick's papers and books, one half of the Cedar Hill property, and $2,000 in cash, she realized that the only hope to preserve the property was for her to buy out the other heirs. Raising the cash by mortgaging the property for $15,000, Helen went heavily into debt. So at almost 60 years of age and not in the best of health, Helen found that she needed a source of income to support not just herself, but Cedar Hill and Frederick's memorial project. To generate that income and realizing that a teaching or office job was a dubious prospect, Helen decided that her most feasible course would be to sell herself, her knowledge, and her name. So taking up her pen, Mrs. Frederick Douglass began a new life as a public lecturer, speaking on such topics as the Hittites, modern Egypt, and her centerpiece presentation, The Convict Lease System, an expose of how Southern state officials raked off large sums by leasing chain gangs of Black prisoners to private businesses to work in conditions little better than slavery. Offering her lectures to various civic and religious groups in the northeastern United States, she charged $25 a talk. Helen also began contacting various Black women's groups to court their support for the Douglass Memorial. In June 1896, she publicly rebuked Susan B. Anthony's National American Women's Suffrage Association, pointing out that, in view of the Women's Suffrage Convention being at the present time held in the city, it seems pertinent to ask why it is that no colored suffragists are either on the platform, among the delegates, or in the audience. Perhaps as a result of this rebuke, Helen was invited to speak the next month at the founding convention of the National Association of Colored Women. Following her presentation, Helen asked the delegates to tour Cedar Hill, ultimately securing their backing for a proposed bill in Congress to establish a preservation association to protect the property. Then, after 5 years of fundraising and seeking political support, Helen's efforts on behalf of Douglass's memory were rewarded when on June 6, 1900, Congress issued a charter for the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association, its goal to be to preserve to posterity the memory of the life and character of the late Frederick Douglass and to collect, collate, and preserve an historical record of the anti-slavery movement. Fittingly, Helen became the association's first president. But as Frederick's memorial was taking place, Helen took the opportunity to hearken back to her Pilgrim connections, applying for membership in the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, only to have the head of the local chapter refuse to even accept her application, stating, because there was a feeling against a white woman who had married a colored man, such as would make trouble in society and be the occasion of resignations. Not one to take such an insult to her beloved husband quietly, Helen excoriated the society in a public letter, staking out the moral high ground and denouncing the prejudice of those who violated what she felt were the ideas which animated her Pilgrim forebears. Helen wrote, and that idea is the idea of personal religious freedom and toleration embodied in the landing of the Mayflower at Plymouth Rock. The simple debarkation of a shipload of people is, in itself, without significance. The impelling motive is what gives dignity to the act, and therefore no Mayflower descendant can be worthy of the name who does not represent the principles for which the landing has always stood and still stands, notwithstanding the moral degeneracy of some of their descendants. At 66 years of age, Helen had been in fragile health for decades. Now, after years of driving herself, giving lectures, raising funds, and seeking public support for Frederick's memorial, she could no longer leave her home or even her bed, but she could still hope that she'd done her best now that she'd done all she could. Mrs. Fred Douglass dead read the small headline buried away on page 12 of the December 2nd, 1903 Democrat and Chronicle. Helen had passed away the previous evening at Cedar Hill of chronic heart disease. She doubtless would not have appreciated the headline, having been known to gently upbraid those she heard abbreviating her late husband's name with, "Do you not think Mr. Douglass lived long enough and well enough to deserve his whole name?" A quiet funeral service was held at Cedar Hill on December 5th. At the service, Reverend Francis Grimke, the minister who married Helen and Frederick in 1884 and who would succeed Helen as president of the Memorial Association, spoke of how, quote, everything connected to Mr. Douglass was precious in her sight. The fact that he was in any way associated with anything put the stamp of sacredness upon it. The chair in which he used to sit had a ribbon tied over it after he passed away so as to prevent anyone from ever occupying it. Guided by Helen's request that there be no public service in Rochester, her brother Gideon escorted her remains to Mount Hope Cemetery for a private, very private burial next to Frederick on December 7th. So private, in fact, that only a passing 1 or 2 line mention of the burial was made in local papers. And there matters sat for almost 70 years. No stone marked Helen's grave. Nothing but grass and weeds covered her resting place. Few visitors to the Douglass plot at Mount Hope had any idea that Douglass was there, that Helen was there, or indeed who Helen was. The only names listed on the 2 existing stones being Frederick's, Anna's, and Little Annie's. Helen's will left Cedar Hill, Frederick's papers, and the mortgage to the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association. By 1916, with $4,000 still due on the property, to the rescue came the National Association of Colored Women, who committed to paying off Cedar Hill's mortgage by 1918, the centennial of Frederick Douglass's birth. Unable to maintain Cedar Hill in 1964, the Memorial Association deeded the property, deeded the property, Douglass's papers to the federal government. The papers were sent to the Library of Congress, and Cedar Hill was taken over by the National Park Service, where, after undergoing extensive renovations, it was reopened to the public on Douglass's birthday, February 14th, 1972. Today, Cedar Hill, officially designated as the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site, continues to honor and commemorate the memory and legacy of Helen's husband. So highly is the site regarded that Cedar Hill was selected to symbolize the District of Columbia on a 2017 quarter issued by the U.S. Mint to honor the National Park Service. A few days after she died, Helen reportedly said to a friend regarding the saving of Cedar Hill, "I do not wish this to be understood to be a colored movement, a movement by the colored people, but a movement by the people, for the people, regardless of color." In 1934, summing up his years of close association with Helen, Frederick, and Cedar Hill, the Reverend Grimke wrote, "This is the way Cedar Hill came to be saved to the race. It was by the self-sacrificing devotion and tenacity of purpose on the part of a white woman and the prompt and energetic support on the part of a group of loyal, race-loving women. All honor to them." Referring to his last visit with Helen before her death, he went on to say, "Among the very last things she said as she lay on her dying bed was, 'See to it that you do not allow my plan for Cedar Hill to fail.' That was her dying admonition. And it is gratifying to be able to say, it has not failed. For years, the only monument to Helen was a small plaque on a wall at Cedar Hill, which read, 'In memory of Helen Pitts Douglass, 1837-1903. By heroic sacrifice, she retained this home that it could be used as a memorial to her beloved husband.' But back at Mount Hope, no one in Rochester or elsewhere lifted a finger to provide a memorial stone for Helen's grave, public apathy allowing it to remain unmarked. Then sometime in the 1970s, with no fanfare, public notice, or press coverage, a monument stone appeared on Helen's grave, inscribed Helen Pitts Douglass, 1838-1903, widow of orator and statesman Frederick Douglass. Through her vision, his greatness was memorialized at Cedar Hill in Washington, D.C. Mrs. Douglass was the founder of the Frederick Douglass Historical and Memorial Association. Subsequently, it was said that the stone had been commissioned by the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association. Perhaps, however, the stone carver had her birth year wrong and had transposed part of the name of the association. And when I contacted the association in 2020, they claimed to have no record of any involvement with the marker. Clearly a woman who always followed her own path towards a goal with no thought of personal reward, had Helen been able to see into the future, she would likely not have been very much troubled to find that even while the Cedar Hill monument she had built for Frederick was prospering and protecting his legacy, her role, indeed her very existence, had been all but forgotten. One last note. There are currently over 300 women in the National Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls. Helen Pitts Douglass isn't one of them. Thank you. Brandon?
1 second, sir. Thank you very much, Michael, for your presentation. That was incredibly informative on a figure who, in my own experience, is simply widely overlooked for a number of reasons, including the lack of memorialization that you just covered at the end. So, ladies and gentlemen, does anyone have any questions for Michael? Feel free to put them in the chat or to join us on camera.
Brandon, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Michael, have you nominated Helen Pitts Douglass for a spot in the National Women's History Hall of Fame?
Brandon, I can't hear down here.
Oh, shoot. Okay. 1 second there.
Technical difficulties.
May not be up on the speaker. Karen, would you mind repeating your question?
Not at all, thank you. Nice talk, Michael. Really interesting and informative. And I was wondering if you had nominated Helen for the National Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls.
Yes, about 4 or 5 years ago.
Keep re-nominating.
Beg
Put
your
in
pardon?
another nomination.
Still having a little trouble hearing you. Could you repeat that, please?
I think you might have to re-nominate.
Oh, yes, you do. You do. I think it's an
Yes.
annual event.
Yeah.
So I should probably do that this year.
I would suggest it. That, I mean, you've shown that she was a remarkable woman that, yeah, does not receive the recognition she should.
Well, as I said, I'll try to do that this year.
Thank you very much, Karen. Anyone else have any questions for us? Well, Michael, it seems you did a very thorough job of covering the topic. A few thank yous coming in over the chat function. If no one has any questions, I guess we'll call it an end for today's presentation, a little earlier than usual. This is our final presentation of the season for Mourning in the Morning. I hope to see everyone again in September when we restart. Again, thank you very much, everyone.